Yes. Hello and welcome to Tuesday Tales of Terror with myself, your host, Collie Mortwood. Okay, tonight we are continuing Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book. Okay, so Bod started to have some trouble at school, right? And has decided that he's not going back. And there are some bullies, Maureen and Nick. Let's go. I need water momentarily. Hydrate. Hydrate, my loves. Hello. Yes. Hello. One more. Thank you for clean water. Let's go. Where are we? We're here. Maureen Quilling had had the worst week of her life. Nick Farthing was no longer speaking to her. Her Uncle Tam had shouted at her about the Owens kid thing, then told her not to mention anything about that evening ever to anyone, as he could lose his job, and he wouldn't want to be in her shoes if that happened. Her parents were furious with her. She felt betrayed by the world. Even the year sevens weren't scared of her any longer. It was rotten. Oh yeah, remember, Bod got picked up in the police car or something because it was Maureen's Uncle Tam, right? Something like that. Okay. She wanted to see that Owens kid again, who she blamed for everything that had happened to her so far, writhing in miserable agony. If he thought being arrested was bad, and then she would concoct elaborate revenge schemes in her head, complex and vicious. They were the only thing that made her feel better, and even they didn't really help. If there was one job that gave Mo the creeps, it was cleaning up the science labs, putting away the Bunsen burners, making sure that all test tubes, petri dishes, unused filter papers, and the like were returned to their places. She only had to do it on a strict rotation system once every 2 months, but it stood to reason that here, in the worst week of her life, she would be in the science lab. At least Mrs. Hawkins, who taught general sciences, was there, collecting papers, gathering things up at the end of the day. Having her there, having anybody there, was comforting. "You're doing a good job, Maureen," said Mrs. Hawkins. A white snake in a jar of preservatives stared blindly down at them. Mo said, "Thanks." "Aren't there meant to be 2 of you?" asked Mrs. Hawkins. "I was supposed to be doing it with the Owens kid," said Mo. "But he hasn't been to school in days now." The teacher frowned. "Which one was he?" she asked absently. "I don't have him down on my list." "Bob Owens. Brownish hair, bit too long. Didn't talk much. He was the one who named all the bones of the skeleton in the quiz, remember?" "Not really," admitted Mrs. Hawkins. "You must remember. Nobody remembers him. Not even Mr. Kirby." Mrs. Hawkins pushed the rest of the sheets of paper into her bag and said, "Well, I appreciate you doing it on your own, dear. Don't forget to wipe down the working surfaces before you go." And she went, closing the door behind her. The science labs were old. There were long, dark wooden tables with gas jets and taps and sinks built into them. And there were dark wooden shelves upon which were displayed a selection of things in large bottles. The things that floated in the bottles were dead, and had been dead for a long time. There was even a yellowed human skeleton in one corner of the room. Mo did not know if it was real or not, but right now it was creeping her out. I love it. I'm so here for it. Every noise she made echoed in that long room. She turned all of the overhead lights on, even the light on the whiteboard, just to make the place less scary. The room began to feel cold. She wished she could turn up the heat. She walked over to one of the large metal radiators and touched it. It was burning hot, but still she was shivering. The room was empty and unsettling in its emptiness, and Mo felt as if she were not alone, as if she were being watched. Well, of course I'm being watched, she thought. 100 dead things in jars, they're all looking at me, not to mention the skeleton. She glanced up at the shelves. That was when the dead things in the jars began to move. A snake with unseeing milky eyes uncoiled in its alcohol-filled jar. A faceless, spiny sea creature twisted and revolved in its liquid home. A kitten, dead for decades, showed its teeth and clawed the glass. Mo closed her eyes. This isn't happening yet, she told herself. I'm imagining it. I'm not frightened, she said aloud. That's good, said someone standing in the shadows by the rear door. It seriously sucks to be frightened, she said. None of the teachers even remember you. But you remember me, said the boy, the architect of all her misfortunes. She picked up a glass beaker and threw it at him, but her aim went wide and it smashed against a wall. How's Nick? Asked Bod, as if nothing had happened. You know how he is, she said. He won't even talk to me. Just shuts up in class, goes home, and does his homework. Probably building model railways. Good, he said. And you, she said. You haven't been at school for a week. You're in such trouble, Bob Owens. The police came in the other day. They were looking for you. That reminds me. How's your Uncle Tam? Said Bod. Mo said nothing. In some ways, said Bod, you've won. I'm leaving school. And in other ways, you haven't. Have you ever been haunted? Maureen Quilling? Ever looked in the mirror, wondering if the eyes looking back at you were yours? Ever sat in an empty room and realized you were not alone? It's not pleasant. You're going to haunt me? Her voice trembled. Bod said nothing at all. He just stared at her. In the far corner of the room, something crashed. Her bag had slipped off the chair onto the floor, and when she looked back, she was alone in the room. Or at least, there was nobody that she could see in there with her. Her way home was going to be very long and very dark. More! Okay. The boy and his guardian stood at the top of the hill, looking out at the lights of the town. Does it still hurt? Asked the boy. A little, said his guardian, but I heal fast. I'll soon be as good as ever. Could it have killed you, stepping out in front of that car? His guardian shook his head. There are ways to kill people like me, he said, but they don't involve cars. I am very old and very tough. Bod said, I was wrong, wasn't I? The whole idea was to do it without anybody noticing. And then I had to get involved with the kids in school. And the next thing you know, there's police and all sorts of stuff. Because I was selfish. Silas raised an eyebrow. You weren't selfish. You need to be among your own kind. Quite understandable. It's just harder out there in the world of the living, and we cannot protect you out there as easily. I wanted to keep you perfectly safe, said Silas. But there is only one perfectly safe place for your kind, and you will not reach it until all your adventures are over, and none of them matter any longer. Bod rubbed his hand over the stone of Thomas R. Stout, 1817 to 1851, deeply regretted by all who knew him, feeling the moss crumble beneath his fingers. "He's still out there," said Bod. "The man who killed my first family. I still need to learn about people. Are you going to stop me from leaving the graveyard?" "No. That was a mistake, and one we have both learned from." "Then what?" "We should do our best to satisfy your interest in stories and books and the world. There are libraries. There are other ways. And there are many situations in which there might be other living people around you, like the theater or the cinema." "What's that? Is it like football? I enjoyed watching them play football at school." "Football? That's usually a little early in the day for me," said Silas. "But Miss Lupescu could take you to see a football match the next time she's here." Miss Lupescu is coming back, so I'm going to have to polish up my French accent. "I'd like that." They began to walk down the hill. Silas said, "We have both left too many tracks and traces in the last few weeks. They are still looking for you, you know." "You said that before. How do you know? And who are they? And what do they want?" But Silas only shook his head and would be drawn no further, and with that, for the time being, Bod had to be satisfied. Okay, that concludes Chapter 6. We are now moving into Chapter 7. Should I turn this up? Are we... Oh, is that better? It's so bright. Let's turn it down. Let's pretend like we don't exist. The dark. Something like that. Anyway, Chapter 7. Every Man Jack. Oh, yeah. Oh, no. Here comes Jack. Silas had been preoccupied for the previous several months. He had begun to leave the graveyard for days, sometimes weeks at a time. Over Christmas, Miss Lupescu had come out for 3 weeks in his place, and Bod had shared her meals in her little flat in the old town. She had even taken him to a football match, as Silas had promised that she would, but she had gone back to the place she called the Old Country after squeezing Bod's cheeks and calling him Nimini, which had become her pet name for him. What is Nimini? Where did she come from? Anyway, now Silas was gone, and Miss Lupescu also. Mr. and Mrs. Owens were sitting in Josiah Worthington's tomb, talking to Josiah Worthington. None of them were happy. Josiah Worthington said, "What is he? You mean to say that he did not tell either of you where he was going, or how the child was to be cared for?" When the Owenses shook their heads, Josiah Worthington said, "Well, where is he?" That is not what I pictured. Anyway, this is the three of them. And this, I guess, is supposed to be Josiah Worthington, and that is not how I pictured him. So I'm going to stick with the accent that I've chosen. Moving on. Neither Owens was able to answer. Master Owen said, "He's never been gone for so long before. And he promised, when the child came to us, promised he would be here, or someone else would be here to help us care for him. He promised." Mrs. Owen said, "I worry that something must have happened to him." She seemed close to tears, and then her tears turned to anger, and she said, "This is too bad of him. Is there no way to find him, to call him back?" "None that I know," said Josiah Worthington, "but I believe that he's left money in the crypt for food for the boy." "Money?" said Mrs. Owens. What use is money?
Bud will be needing money if he's to go out there and buy food,
began Mr. Owens, but Mrs. Owens turned on him.
You're all as bad as each other,
she said. She left the Worthington tomb, and she went looking for her son, whom she found, as she expected to, at the top of the hill, staring out over the town.
Penny for your thoughts,
said Mrs. Owens.
You don't have a penny, said Bod.
He was 14 now, and taller than his mother.
Well, I've got 2 in the coffin, said Mrs. Owens. Probably a bit green by now, but I've still got them right enough.
I was thinking about the world, said Bod. How do we even know that the person who killed my family is still alive? That he's out there?
Silas says he is.
But Silas doesn't tell us anything else.
He means only the best for you. You know that.
Thanks. Where is he? Mrs. Owens made no reply. You saw the man who killed my family, didn't you? On the day you adopted me. Mrs. Owens nodded. What was he like?
Mostly, I had eyes for you. Let me see. He had dark hair, very dark, and I was frightened of him. He had a sharp face, hungry and angry all at once he was. Silas saw him off.
Why didn't Silas just kill him? Said Bod fiercely. He should have just killed him then. Mrs. Owens touched the back of Bod's hand with her cold fingers. She said,
He's not a monster, Bod.
Well, if Silas had killed him back then, I would be safe now. I could go anywhere.
Silas knows more than you do about all this. More than any of us do. And Silas knows about life and death, said Mrs. Owens. It's not that easy.
And what's his name? The man who killed them?
He didn't say it. Not then.
Bod put his head on one side and stared at her with eyes as gray as thunderclouds.
But you know it, don't you? There's nothing you can do, Bod.
There is. I can learn. I can learn everything I need to know. All I can. I learned about ghoul gates. I learned to dream walk. Miss Lupescu taught me how to watch the stars. Silas taught me silence. I can haunt. I can fade. I know every inch of this graveyard. Mrs. Owens reached out a hand, touched her son's shoulder. One day, she said, and then she hesitated. One day she would not be able to touch him. One day he would leave them. One day. And then she said,
Silas told me the man who killed your family was called Jack.
Bod said nothing. Then he nodded. Mother?
What is it, son?
When will Silas come back? The midnight wind was cold, and it came from the north.
From the north.
Mrs. Owens was no longer angry. She feared for her son. She said only, I wish I knew, my darling boy. I wish I knew. Okay, where are we at? 19 minutes on the dot. Scarlet Amber Perkins. Scarlet Amber Perkins was 15, and at that moment, sitting on the upper deck of the elderly bus, she was a mass of angry hate. She hated her parents for splitting up. She hated her mother for moving away from Scotland. Hated her father because he didn't seem to care that she had gone. She hated this town for being so different. Nothing like Glasgow, where she had grown up. Oh, no. And she hated it because every now and again she would turn a corner and see something, and the world would all become achingly, horribly familiar. She had lost it with her mother that morning. Am I supposed to try to do a Scottish accent? I can't. Let me channel Merida. Let me channel Merida. Hold on.
Wee bear. At least in Glasgow I had friends.
Ooh. Oh, Scarlet had said, and she wasn't quite shouting, and she wasn't quite sobbing.
I'll never see them again.
All her mother had said in reply was,
At least you'll... At least you're somewhere you've been before. I mean, we lived here when you were little.
I don't remember, said Scarlet.
And it's not like I still know anyone. Do you want me to find my old friends from when I was 5? Is that what you want?
And her mother said,
Well, I'm not stopping you.
I can't do Scottish. We're gonna have to scrap it. Scarlet had gone through the whole of the school day angry, and she was angry now. She hated her school, and she hated the world, and right now she particularly hated the town bus service. Every day when school was over, the 97 bus to the city center would take her from her school gates all the way to the end of the street where her mother had rented a small flat. She had waited at the bus stop on that gutsy, that's a very brave day. That gusty April day for almost half an hour, and no 97 buses had appeared. I've been here. It's so awful. Okay, so when I lived in England, I did have to catch the city bus to school, and some days the bus doesn't show up for like 2 hours. It's the worst, but I get it. So I get it. So when she saw a 121 bus with city center as its destination, she had climbed aboard. But when her bus always turned right, this one turned left into the old town, past the municipal gardens and the old town square, past the statue of Josiah Worthington, Baronet, and then crept up a winding hill lined with high houses as Scarlet's heart sank and her anger was replaced with misery. She walked downstairs, edged forward, and eyed the sign telling her not to speak to the driver when the vehicle was in motion, and said, Excuse me, I wanted to go to Acacia Avenue. The driver, a large woman, I used to live on Acacia Street, and I just mentioned this the other day. That is very spooky. I just got goosebumps. The driver, a large woman, her skin even darker than Scarlet's, said, You should have got the 97 then. But this goes to the city centre. Eventually. But even when you get there, you'll still need to get back, the woman sighed. Best thing you can do, get off here, walk back down the hill. There's a bus stop in front of the town hall. And there you catch the number 4 or the 58. Both of them will take you most of the way to Acacia Avenue. You could get off by the sports centre and walk up from there. You got all that? Aye, the 4 or the 58. I'll let you off here. It was a request stop on the side of the hill, just past a large pair of open iron gates, and it looked uninviting and dismal. Scarlet stood in the open doorway of the bus until the bus driver said, Go on, hop it. She stepped down on the pavement, and the bus belched black smoke and roared away. The wind rattled the trees on the other side of the wall. Scarlet began to walk back down the hill. What time are we? This was why she needed a mobile phone, she thought. If she was so much as 5 minutes late, her mother would freak. But she still wouldn't buy Scarlet a phone of her own. Oh well. She would have to endure another shouting match. It wouldn't be the first, and it wouldn't be the last. By now, she was level with the open gates. She glanced inside, and, That's odd, she said aloud. That's odd. There's an expression, déjà vu, that means that you feel like you've been somewhere before, that you've somehow already dreamed it or experienced it in your mind. Scarlett had experienced it, the knowledge that a teacher was just about to tell them that she'd been to Inverness on holiday, or that someone had dropped a spoon in just that way before. This was different. This wasn't a feeling that she had been here before. This was the real thing. Scarlett walked through the open gates into the graveyard. A magpie flew up as she walked in, a flash of black and white and iridescent green, and settled in the branches of a yew tree, watching her. Around that corner, she thought, is a church, with a bench in front of it. And she turned a corner to see a church, much smaller than the one in her head. A sinister, blocky little Gothic building of grey stone with a jutting spire. In front of it was a weathered wooden bench. She walked over, sat down on the bench, swung her legs as if she was still a little girl. "Hello? Hello," said a voice from behind her. "Awful cheek of me. Who is this?" "Oh, awful cheek of me, I know, but would you help me down this, just really need another pair of hands if it's not too much trouble?" Scarlett looked around and saw a man in a fawn-colored raincoat squatting in front of a gravestone. He was holding a large sheet of paper which was blowing about in the wind. She hurried over to him. I'm just trying to see who it is because I do the voices. Anyway, "You hold on to it here," said the man. "One hand here, one hand there, that's it. Frightful imposition, I know. Ridiculously grateful." He had a biscuit tin next to him, and from the tin he pulled what looked like a crayon from the size of a small candle. He began rubbing it back and forth across the stone with easy, practiced movements. "There we go," he said cheerfully. "Is it Bod? And here she comes. Oops. A wiggly bit down at the bottom here. I think it's meant to be ivy. The Victorians loved putting ivy on things. Deeply symbolic, you know. There we are. You can let go now." He stood up, ran one hand through his gray hair. Oh no, it is an old man. "Oh, well, needed to stand. Legs got pins and needles," he said. "So what do you reckon to that?" The actual headstone was covered in green and yellow lichen, and so worn and faded as to almost be undecipherable, but the rubbing was clear. "Margella Godspeed, spinster of this parish, 1791-1870, lost to all but memory." Oh, she lived a long time, yeah, 89 years. 79 years, and probably now lost even to that, said the man. His hair was thinning, and he smiled hesitantly and blinked at her through small round glasses, which made him look a little like a friendly owl. A large raindrop splashed down on the paper, and the man hurriedly rolled it up and grabbed his tin box of crayons. Another handful of raindrops, and Scarlett picked up the portfolio the man pointed to, propped up beside a nearby gravestone, and followed him into the tiny porch of the church, where the rain could not touch them. "Well, thank you so much," said the man. "I don't think it's really going to rain much. Weather forecast for this afternoon said mostly sunny." As if in reply, the wind gusted coldly, and the rains began to beat down in earnest. "Oh, no." "I know what you're thinking," the gravestone-rubbing man said to Scarlett. "You do?" she said. She had been thinking, "My mum will kill me." "You're thinking,
Is this a church or a funeral chapel?" And the answer is, as far as I can ascertain, that on this site there was indeed a small church, and the original graveyard would have been in its churchyard. Not as long ago as perhaps 900 AD. Rebuilt and extended several times in there, but there was a fire here in the 1820s, and by that time it was already too much for the area. Already much too small for the area. People around here were using St. Dunstan's in the village square as their parish church, and so when they came to rebuild here, they made it a funeral chapel.
keeping many of the original features. The stained glass windows in the far wall are said to be original.
Actually, said Scarlet, I can't do Scottish. We're moving on. Actually, said Scarlet, I was thinking that my mum is going to kill me. I've got the wrong bus, and I'm already late home.
Good Lord, you poor thing, said the man. Look, I only just live down the road. You wait here.
And with that, he thrust his portfolio, his tin of crayons, and his rolled-up sheet of paper into her hands, and he set off at a trot down to the gates, his shoulders hunched against the driving rain. A couple of minutes later, Scarlet saw the lights of a car and heard the sound of a car horn. Beep, beep. Scarlet ran down to the gates, where she could see the car, an elderly green Mini. The man she had been talking to was sitting in the driver's seat. He wound down his window.
Come on, he said. Where exactly am I taking you?
Scarlet stood there, the rain running down her neck.
I don't take rides from strangers.
Smart. I was thinking the same thing.
Quite right, too. But one good turn deserves, and all that. Here, put the stuff in the back before it gets soaked.
He pulled open the passenger door, and Scarlet leaned inside and put his grave-rubbing equipment down on the back seat as best she could.
Tell you what, he said. Why don't you phone your mother? You can use my phone, and tell her my car's number plate. You can do it from inside the car. You're getting soaked out there.
Scarlet hesitated. Rain was beginning to plaster her hair down. It was cold. The man reached over and handed her his mobile phone. Scarlet looked at it. She realized she was more afraid of calling her mother than she was of getting into the car. Then she said,
I could call the police too, couldn't I?
You certainly can, yes. You can walk home. You can just call your mother and ask her to come and pick you up.
Scarlet got into the passenger seat and closed the door. She kept hold of the man's phone.
Where do you live?
The man asked. You really don't have to. I mean, you could just take me up to the bus stop.
I'll take you home. Address?
102A Acacia Avenue. It's off the main road, a wee bit past the big sports centre.
You are out of your way, aren't you? Right, let's get you home.
He took off the handbrake, swung the car around, and drove down the hill.
Been living here long? He said.
Not really. We moved here just after Christmas. We lived here when I was 5, though.
Is that the brogue I detect in your accent?
Brogue? We've been living in Scotland for 10 years. There I sounded like everyone else. And then I came down here, and now I stick out like a sore thumb.
She'd wanted it to sound like a joke, but it was true, and she could hear it as she said it. Not funny, just bitter. The man drove to Acacia Avenue, parked in front of the house, then insisted on coming up to the front door with her. When the door was open, he said,
Frightfully sorry. I took the liberty of bringing your daughter back to you. Obviously, you taught her well. She shouldn't accept rides from strangers. But when it was raining, she took the wrong bus. Wound up on the other side of town. Bit of a mess all round, really. Say you can find it in your heart to forgive. Forgive her. And me.
Scarlet expected her mother to shout at both of them, and was surprised and relieved when her mother only said,
Well, you couldn't be too careful these days.
And,
Was Mr. a teacher?
And,
Would you like a cup of tea?
Mr. said his name was Frost, but she could call him Jay, and Mrs. Perkins smiled, and he could call her Nuna, and she put the kettle on. Oh, my goodness, we've gone over. Okay, well, great. That is our time. We are well into chapter 7. I'm enjoying these characters. I will practice a Scottish accent and also my French again. I'm excited to be here, and I hope you are too. All right, I love you. I love you. I hope that you find peace in your life. Stay spooky, stay weird, and get out of here, you weirdos.